Now, Zionism came, but we have to backtrack like 50 to 100 years before Zionism. There was a movement called Reform Judaism. That was a movement by this person who was a scholar, but you can always find people who are deeply flawed, who are rotten to the core, who are evil, even though they could be a scholar. That's not always a contradiction, unfortunately, or maybe even a lot of times it's not a contradiction. So you had this scholar, his name was Moses Mendelssohn. We say his name should be obliterated. He came along and he created the movement called Reform Judaism. Reform is exactly what it is, to reform, to change Judaism. So their concept, this was before Zionism, their concept was that they were living in Europe, and they felt that the Jews are always belittled and looked down upon. So they had this concept that we'll secularize, we'll assimilate amongst the nations. You don't have to dress like a Jew, you don't have to follow it. But altogether, he said, they refuted the fact that God gave Moses the Torah on Mount Sinai. The concept was Moses made a book, and you can pick and choose what you want from it. So he made this movement. And of course, the rabbinical authorities, the Jewish communities that were religious, right away stood up in vehement opposition to this and said, this is blasphemy, it's totally false. God gave Moses the Torah and we're not allowed to stray from it even 1 iota. We have to, it's a covenant we made, we have to uphold all the laws of the Torah. We did that for now 3,000 years. We give our lives for that. But unfortunately he came along and he made it very pleasant. He created things that you don't have to uphold, only what they felt comfortable with. They started dressing in their synagogues. They called it temples, referring to the temple, I gather, in Jerusalem. So they dressed like in the Christians, like the priests dressed, and they brought in an organ, and even not allowed to play music on the Sabbath. Sabbath is forbidden to use electric or whatever. Many others. And they brought in different, this was before electric, but I'm just saying many things are forbidden for us on the Sabbath. So they brought in things that are forbidden, and they totally changed what Judaism is in its essence. Again, they refuted that you have to keep the laws. Now, in order to gain legitimacy, what they did was they made their own rabbinate. They ordained they called them reverends or rabbis, and different things, and so that gives them, in other words, the power and the legitimacy that they're not just some rebels. Unfortunately, the works of Satan, we say, it was very popular, reform, and it became, Jews suffered a lot, and it was very good. They made it very, very pleasant, and many Jews, especially of Germany and Austria, they became Reform Jews, and it spread to the United States, and we have really defies logic, but I think like close to 90% or something in that area today are not Orthodox. They're Reform. Now, Reform went so far that anything that's in the Torah that's forbidden, keeping the Sabbath, we should not make fire on the Sabbath, open lights, drive a car. They went and they just discarded everything. Now, they went so far that many Jews already saw they were uncomfortable with that, even from the Reform, so they became conservative. Now, the conservative is, they're more conservative than the Reform, but they don't accept, like an Orthodox Jew. Orthodox is that we accept that you're not allowed to stray from Judaism at all. You have to uphold all the laws as it was given to us. And when everything changes, the times change. But today you have electric. 3,000 years ago, you didn't have electric. So, but in the Torah, I'm giving an example. It says you're not allowed to make a fire on the Sabbath in the Ten Commandments. It's to remember that God created the world on 6 days. The seventh day He rested. So one of the things it says in the Torah, not to make fire on the Sabbath. So now, when they make electric, so then the rabbis discussed this issue: is electric? Are you allowed to use it on the Sabbath or not? So they decided it's fire and so forth, and we're not allowed to open a light on the Sabbath. What we do is we can easily leave it on before the Sabbath. We don't sit in the darkness, but we have to create our situation, conform our situation that it should be accepted. It should follow in the laws of the Torah. Reform just ignores that totally. Conservative also basically doesn't uphold the laws of the Torah. Orthodoxy is that we are totally following the laws of the Torah. We're conforming ourselves to the Torah, even though it's modern today. But our modern lives are totally to be acceptable according to the laws of the Torah 3,000 years ago. We don't say that the Torah changed. We look at God as omnipresent, above time. So the Torah is like a blueprint. It's above time, that the world that's running is from the blueprint of the Torah, we believe. Sort of, I'm just giving a very concise explanation. So basically, we believe that everything in the Torah for all times is in the Torah. So our lives ought to be acceptable according to this Torah that was given to us 3,000 years ago. It's a live Torah, we say. Now, that was 300 years ago, this reform. And they became rampant. It was spread out throughout Europe and so forth. So then, like 50 to 100 years later, the children, grandchildren of these movements, when they saw, they already felt that they weren't obligated to the laws of God because they were reformed. They did what they wanted, basically. So from that was really the seed of where Zionists come from. Because Zionists decided, well, this is not working. They're secular. They're assimilated amongst the nation. You can't recognize they're Jews at all. Yet they'll go to a bar, and the guy, the drinking with, will get drunk and say, "You dirty Jew," and they had that. In fact, there was a very famous case called in Vienna. It was actually in France. With Captain Dreyfus, the Dreyfus trial. Very famous, So here was a captain in the French army in the 1880s, 1890s,
something like this,
like that. And he was an assimilated Jew, and he was accused of espionage. And then, and I'm embarrassed, I'm sorry, I forget all the names. There was a very distinguished editor of a newspaper, reporter, and he felt something's fishy. And he started delving into this and searching, and he decided that something's wrong, and after much work, selfless work, because he was attacked very badly because he was going against the judges and the army of France, and they found that it was totally false. It was a false accusation to cover up for somebody else. So they took this Jew as a scapegoat. Now, and then in France, like, it swam up the concept of anti-Semitism, because it became an issue in France, and there was a lot of anti-Semitic statements, and it was very polarizing in France. Now, at that time, there was Theodor Herzl, who was the father of Zionism, and he said, "You see, we're assimilated, didn't work, it's not working. Let's make our own country, our own nation, we'll protect ourselves. And that will be the solution for everything." So they came along and they decided to make their own nation state. And that is what Zionism was about. They decided to make their own national home. Now, very ironically, many of the Reform didn't want that because they didn't want to stick out. They wanted to assimilate. So they really opposed it, many of the leaders of Reform. But being what Reform is, that they're not obligated to God, eventually when it became very popular, Zionism, so they went along with the flow, and they also became very pro-Zionist, as they are around the world today. So you have a lot of the Reform, they're supportive of Zionism. Zionism is the transformation of spirituality, subservience to God, to nationalism, a material concept of having a land, of being a nation amongst nations, unacceptable, totally unacceptable according to the Torah. As I've mentioned earlier, we are under oath by God, first of all, that we are not to leave exile. We are not to return en masse and make our own nation state. In fact, we're not only not allowed to return to the Holy Land and make a state, but we're not allowed to make our own state anywhere because it's a decree of exile. Now, Zionism came along, and they decided, they had no respect for the words of God, and they said, we will make our own nationhood. And that is what Judaism is about. They really turned it on its head, what Judaism is. We're a nation amongst nations. So, firstly, when they had their first meetings, a lot of times I show pictures of their meetings. If anybody can Google it, the first Congress of the Zionist Congress. Here, let's say this is a picture. David Ben-Gurion reading the Declaration of Independence in 1948 in Independence Hall. Now, if you look at what they're sitting here, the whole crowd, you'll know. You can look it up. You won't find one single person covering his head, I don't think, here. You can see these are not. Judaism is a religion. I mean, you go to Christianity, you go to, you'll see, you go to Islam, what's the leaders of Islam? You'll see people with the turbans. You go to the Pope and the priests and everything. Now, how ridiculous what does this picture look like when he's declaring a Jewish state? Is this what you expect to be seeing? You should be seeing as when we sit together, our rabbis, a group of scholars, sages, old people that from the rabbinical authorities. That's basically it. Judaism is a religion, right? That's what it is. It is a religion. I don't think anybody can refute the fact that what Judaism was is Moses going up on Mount Sinai, taking the Torah, and this is what we are. So who is our leader? Some politician? It's ridiculous. It's repugnant, really, for somebody to come along and you take a group, Theodor Herzl, and you sit yourself down and make your statements of independence, making your declaration, deciding your laws and so forth, and a bunch of politicians, lacking any fear of God, any acceptance of the words of God, desecrators of the Torah. So this was what Zionism is basically. Now Zionism, what is Zionism? They make a state. They made a state. They made a declaration of independence. They didn't put God's name in the declaration of independence. They had a whole fight about it. There was some religious that can you do that? So they put in Tzur Yisrael, the rock of the Jews, because they didn't even want to use God's name. They made a law system. Our law system is the Torah. That's what we have to. In fact, it's considered blasphemy if a Jew does not follow his life in the laws of the Torah. It's considered blasphemy if you go to a court. And if let's say there's somebody has a dispute, a business in a business, the law is that a Jew has to go to a Jewish court. In other words, to rabbis, and that's the law. If you don't, you go to the local law system. It's considered blasphemy because God is not good enough. In other words, God gave us a law system. That is the law. There's no question. You must go to a rabbinical court. And that said, of course, if a Jew has something to, God forbid, a dispute with a non-Jew, you go to, if they want arbitration, they could go to a Jewish court. That's the law also. So you can go to anybody for arbitration. But if the non-Jew wants, of course, could go to a court. You could go to a court if it's with a non-Jew. But a Jew has to go to a Jewish court. The rabbis then could say, look, we can't force that person to follow through with the law. So then they give you permission for a Jew to go to the court, but they have to have permission for that. But we have a law system. The Zionist state, they made their law system. That's totally not the Jewish law system. That's a fact. They also made a rabbinate. Their rabbinate is like Reform made a rabbinate, simply to give this a facade of Judaism, to give them the legitimacy, so they made a rabbinate with the chief rabbi and so forth. Why did they do that? Only to make it look kosher, to make it look legitimate, but it's totally not legitimate. So they made the law system, which is and simply as a facade, they went and they made also a rabbinate. So now this rabbinate gives them legitimacy, but their law system, they detest the Torah, so they have another law system. What's wrong with our law system? We have all the laws, replete for thousands of years that we follow if there's any dispute in any manner, any issue. So we Jews follow this. The Jewish issue is that we are anti-Zionist. We never can accept the occupation. It's against our religion. The Zionism is full of hypocrisy. Like I say, they made the court system. They made the thing of independence. The language, modern Hebrew, right? It's called modern Hebrew, Ivrit, modern Hebrew. Modern Hebrew is not what our language is. We have Lashon Kodesh, the holy language, that the prayer books, and we speak when we usually don't speak because it's a holy language. We use it for prayer and so forth. Why did they change the language? We have a language that was given by God. It's full of books on language and so forth for thousands of years. And all of a sudden they come to make a Jewish state and they change the language. Because they detest the religion. They wanted something, a nationalism. They're trying to uproot the religion. They mentioned the Maccabees. They come in their school system. They take all the concepts of Judaism, the stories of the Jewish, our history, and they turn it on its head. They teach their children about Maccabees. They don't tell them what Maccabees were, that they fought, they gave their lives to uphold the Sabbath. On the contrary, they breach the Sabbath. They just look at it as a few against many. They don't use, they gutted the whole story of the Maccabees, that they gave their lives for one thing, to keep the Sabbath, to keep God's Torah. They could have, they were happy, they were living under, happy I can't say, but they were living under the Greeks like God commanded us. They went to, so they used this word Maccabee, for their Olympic team that desecrates the Sabbath. They play on the Sabbath, they use their games on the Sabbath, they do everything. So it's totally, it's so criminal, there's no words. They're using our Torah. Rabbi Kaplan goes on to say that they went to the Temple Mount and they made demonstrations there. They weren't religious. The day that I mentioned earlier, we mourn and we fast. On Tisha B'Av, that's great. We're not allowed to eat. It's the most stringent, just like Yom Kippur. We do not eat. We do not drink. The Zionists come together, boys and girls. We're not allowed to go. Boys and girls dance together. They would come together by the temple, by the Western Wall, where the Jews go there, the Wailing Wall, whatever you call, and they would dance and eat and drink and dance over there. So far that there was a rabbi who was from that community. I knew him. His name was Rabbi Cohen. He was somebody from the old city. He lived there before the Zionists came. So he lived in the old city of Jerusalem together with the Muslims before the Zionists came. And he passed away a few years ago. And we have some taping of his because he spoke there. And he told us, he said that the Arabs started giving it a call like the holiday day. Instead of our day of mourning, they gave it the Yom, they called like a feast day, Yom Edom, or something like that. They called Yom Edom because they would go, the Zionists, and dance and over there by the wall. So it's like flaunting we consider the Holy of Holies, the Western Wall.